retrospective over a 40-year legacy of John Carpenter's Halloween all started in the mind of a man named Irwin Yablans. He was working at Warner Brothers in the late 1960s as a mover of actual film. He then got noticed at WB, and they quickly gave him the job to be a booker, and would eventually be given weirder, oddball jobs at the company over the years, with one of them being setting up sneak previews for various films. During this time, Yablin's wife recommended that he should start making his own movies, and he agreed. Well, around this time, a young prospective student named John Carpenter just finished work on a little film called Dark Star at USC for $60,000, which got a limited theatrical release despite some post-production problems. Yablans was in a bit of a funk because he couldn't find any movies to produce. Eventually, John Carpenter's next film, an action exploitation film inspired by Howard Hawks' films entitled The Siege, landed in his lap. He loved the film and was amazed that no one was picking this up. After a name change to Assault on Precinct 13, Yablans released the film to middling results in the US, but it exploded in the UK. In fact, a man named Michael Myers entered the film into the London Film Festival and it won first place. So after all this was said and done, Yablans got to thinking on what his next film should be. It had to be with Carpenter to take advantage of this major talent. His idea was based around babysitters being terrorized on the scariest night of the year, Halloween. He woke up in the middle of the night to call John Carpenter about it, who liked the idea and agreed to meet with him the very next day about it. It's also worth noting that the film was never supposed to be called The Babysitter Murders. From its inception on that night when Yablans woke up in his bed to tell his wife and Carpenter about his idea, it was always supposed to be called Halloween.
No, none of that's true. There was no such thing as babysitter murders ever. Remember, I'm the sole source because it came right from here.
You heard it here first. So when babysitter murders comes up in conversation, you have that feeling of superiority to tell them they're wrong. Anywho, they eventually met up for lunch and got the film going with some stipulation from Carpenter about creative freedom, having Deborah Hill produce, and having his name above the title, which Yablans promised, and pretty much promised him anything as long as he could do it for $300,000. Also, Yablans wanted no blood because he felt that what you don't see is scariest, relating it back to the suspense audio dramas from his childhood, which Carpenter agreed with. So, he and Deborah Hill wrote the film in about 2 weeks and eventually started with the other bouts of pre-production with casting. Carpenter wanted both Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing for the role of Loomis, a role which they both declined. But Yablans pushed for Donald Pleasance due to his performance in Will Penny. Another significant point was the famous mask that Tommy Lee Wallace was tasked with getting. While he saw Richard Nixon and Mr. Spock masks, he settled on two, an Emmett Kelly clown mask and a Captain James T. Kirk mask. The clown mask was considered rather eerie, but the Kirk mask was considered so fucking creepy by everyone involved. Obviously, Wallace changed it up so it had bigger eye holes, no eyebrows and sideburns, darkened hair, and a painted white face. Everyone loved it. With this, production went rather smoothly, with some bumps along the way, mainly relating to stretching a small budget in the best ways possible and a drunk Donald Pleasance. However, it went as smooth as an indie film could go. In post-production, Carpenter made the famous theme in only 3 days, and they changed the ending to make it even more chilling. It was supposed to just end with Loomis and his perspective, but they ended with the establishing shots, showcasing that the shape could still be out there, anywhere, watching you. Yablans tried to distribute the film through a big studio, but no one wanted to touch this film with a 39.5-foot pole. Horror movies were considered degenerative and lesser films. So, with his past in being a booker, Yablans ultimately distributed the film himself, opening in Kansas City, Missouri on October 25th, 1978. It was a huge success and became an exponential hit, with Yablans taking it to even bigger cities. It eventually garnered $70 million worldwide and became one of the most successful indie films ever made. Even notorious horror hater Roger Ebert loved the film, giving it 4 stars, calling it reminiscent of Psycho. It eventually went on to have 10 sequels, including the newly released Halloween Ends, and a remake and its sequel, and became one of the biggest horror franchises of all time. I really don't know how to start this review, because Halloween is a stone-cold classic. The Thing, at least, has less of that aura and vibe behind it because it failed. It was a failure for years until many people went back to it and realized how fucking amazing it really was. This pretty much always had this love from the beginning. It always had an audience. Michael Myers is a cultural icon. The theme music is one of the most recognizable film scores in cinematic history. Laurie Strode is one of the most beloved characters in horror and beyond. I will try my absolute best to make this video as unique as I possibly can and not reiterate what everyone else has said to the best of my ability. I actually don't remember when I first watched this film, but it was probably one of the first horror movies I ever really experienced. That just kind of feels right to me saying that. I think it was early high school when I really started to get into horror movies. I mean, by 2013, I was a big enough fan to see the film in theaters when it was re-released for the 35th anniversary with a couple friends of mine. Now, unlike The Thing, since I cannot really remember my first experience with it and what I felt at the time, I can't really go over it. By 16 years old, I was very much in love with the movie. I didn't fully understand its flaws yet because at that point in my life, I thought that recognizing flaws meant you didn't like something, when that simply isn't the case. Halloween is a pretty flawed movie. Some of the acting is really bad. You can see palm trees in the background even though it's supposed to be Illinois, and some of it seems rather dated, mainly in the dialogue.
Totally.
However, considering Carpenter had not perfected his craft just yet, that's okay. It's still an amazing feat and still a classic this many years later. Halloween is simply a movie that manages to enrich itself in its tension and atmosphere. While I still confound that The Thing does everything better in terms of those specific things, but Halloween will forever remain scarier because of its tone and setting. The Thing is perfected craftsmanship, while Halloween is haunting and bare-bones terror at its finest. It takes the simple idea of a stalker and someone beyond the darkness just watching you and amplifies that. That thing you see in your peripheral when you're in your house alone at night, that could be someone watching you. Something that chose you to watch, to hunt, to gaze at you in your most vulnerable state. All taking place in an idyllic small town, the most boring place to be. But Carpenter makes this idea of a small town where nothing happens, the epitome of Americana, where everyone knows your name and makes it hold a dark secret, something bubbling beneath the surface that is waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Taking that idea of All Hallows Eve, where the mountains run red with the blood of children, and using it here in the simplest way possible, yet makes it modern. Attaching the new ideals of serial killers like John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and David Berkowitz, who were rampant around this time as well. It's no wonder that Carpenter and Hill thought the idea of the ultimate evil actually existed, to the point that the name Michael Myers is barely mentioned in the script, and he's only called The Shape, which is also terrifying in and of itself. Just a word and not really all that mysterious in and of itself. The being or the shadow maybe could be intimidating, but the shape? I don't know about that, but it just sort of clicks. I like the idea of Michael. Carpenter tried so very hard to make him the ultimate evil. No emotion, no reason, no conscience, and most importantly, no humanity. A 6-year-old child on the night of Halloween in 1963 snapped. He murdered his sister and showed no regret of doing such a deplorable action, and we never find out why. He is just an unstoppable force that will go through life and try to finish his mission of death, whatever that may be. I absolutely adore this idea. We didn't need him hunting his bloodline, being a part of a cult, or have him be part of a dysfunctional family. We just needed to see a boy doing one of the worst actions you can possibly do as a human being, only for him to shed that idea of humanity when doing this one simple act of murder. That's what makes him one of the scariest out of all the slasher villains, is because he's just evil incarnate that won't stop until you're dead. Carpenter used Yul Brynner in Westworld as inspiration, implying that the shape is now just an instrument of death. I wouldn't be surprised if James Cameron used Halloween and Michael Myers as direct inspiration for the T-800 and the Terminator, because of the similarities between the concept and ideas of their killers.
That Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop, ever, until you are dead.
As much as I like Freddy and Jason and Pinhead, they aren't that scary personality-wise, mainly because Jason and Freddy still have a very human motivation. Vengeance. Even though both of them are way more supernatural than Michael, they are still tethered to the concepts of humanity. Pinhead is simply the being of a place that may or may not exist, so that isn't inherently that scary either. While the concept of Freddy is the scariest because he's taking away what we as humans need, sleep. But even then, if someone asked me what I'd be scared of walking down the hall, a burned guy in a fedora with a Christmas sweater calling me a bitch, or a mechanical, unstoppable killing machine with no concept of good and evil with no face. Yeah, I'm going with the latter. Easily. Michael, the shape, is simply death with a face, and once you see him, you will die or suffer a fate worse than death. Survival. Speaking of, let's talk about our main three girls, plus the one boyfriend we see. Linda and Bob are pretty much nothing characters. They exist to die. While Linda is memorable for all the wrong reasons,
Totally.
her character is incessantly annoying throughout the whole film until her death. Bob, I will say, has a really cool death scene and a great example of the shape playing with his food, so to speak. Because people kind of forget how much of a trickster Michael really is throughout the movie. I mean, the scene at the Wallace house with Laurie finding everyone was a great scene, and showcases Michael as more so than just a guy who kills people. He's mischievous and he's intelligent, which makes him even scarier. Annie, I will say, is slightly better because I feel there is more to her character than just being a slut. She's memorable and has a bit of a no-nonsense attitude to her character, which I appreciate. She's still pretty annoying at times, but I feel she has a bit more of a character than Linda does. Then that leaves Laurie Strode, the template for the final girl that everyone draws from whether they know it or not. She's a great and identifiable character to us, as the audience surrogate, essentially. We are intrigued with her, we are scared with her, and we are introspective with her. Jamie Lee Curtis showcases perfectly on how to be a surrogate for the audience, while also being her own character. She was relatable as well, showing the terror she felt while being in this situation. It felt like a full experience through her. It felt like more than a movie through her. Due to Halloween's simplicity, it felt like a richer experience. It felt real. It might not be perfect, but what you feel when watching and what you are experiencing feels like more than just a movie. Now we get to the more heroic side of our characters with Dr. Loomis and Sheriff Lee Brackett. Despite not having a ton of screen time, Dr. Loomis becomes one of the most important characters in the Halloween mythos. Hell, I would dare say the most important next to Michael. He is like a Paul Revere of sorts, warning everybody of the doom that will come to their small town through various monologues and speeches about evil incarnate taking the form of a seemingly human man.
I met him 15 years ago. I was told there was nothing left. No reason, no conscience, no understanding, and even the most rudimentary sense of life or death, of good or evil, right or wrong. I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Donald Pleasance did this flawlessly, despite not being a fan of the script and felt like he was above the movie he was acting in. Despite this, he still delivered a magnificent performance, and one of the best of the series. Marlon Brando could have learned a thing or two from Pleasance. Dr. Sam Loomis became the closest this series had to a full-fledged hero, even though he was far from perfect. Instead of doing things that could have possibly helped the town of Haddonfield, he let 3 innocent kids die and would have that on his conscience forever. Despite doing the best he could, some of the deaths on his mind are his fault. So he isn't perfect, and that definitely makes him a more interesting character. Then there's Sheriff Lee Brackett. While a fan favorite, he doesn't have a ton to do in the original film. He's a great character, don't get me wrong, and he does all that he can to protect his town. However, some interactions with other characters are a bit off, and shows that he's a bit of a weird fellow. Unfortunately, between the heroic characters of the film, everything falls on Sam Loomis, with Brackett sort of just picking up the scraps. He still is good here, especially when he's unaware of his own daughter's death. Despite trying his best to save his own town, he could save his own daughter, which is an interesting concept that got a good conclusion in the sequel. Probably the most iconic thing to come out of this entire franchise is the music. It is arguably the most recognizable horror theme of all time, next to The Exorcist's Tubular Bells, and Saw's Hello Zep. I would even say it is one of the most recognizable movie scores in cinematic history. It once again drives home that perfect simplicity that Halloween has. The needling of the synthesizer, the piano melody, the drones in the background, and how it constantly changes itself. It's just sort of perfect. Throughout the entirety of the theme, those three aspects of the theme are constantly shifting to random states, similar to the Shape himself. He's random. He just sort of chooses Laurie out of thin air, and anyone who gets in his way are extinguished. This theme perfectly feeds into that. The ideas of not only the film's simplicity in and of itself, but Michael's motivations in a way, which isn't anything. All we do know, it's random. Who he chooses to torture, who he kills. We will never know that motivation, and the music perfectly feeds into that. The main theme also really makes you feel uneasy. It doesn't go out of its way to try and scare you. It doesn't overburden you with noise. It just invokes a feeling of unease, of something that is off. It tickles your brain and makes you believe that you are being watched, or worse. Much like the film it's attached to, it's brilliant in its simplicity. As well as the other bits of music, like The Last Assault, which is this tension-filled hit to the face to really drive home what's happening on screen. The main theme might be the crowning achievement, but the other tracks feeding into that unease should be duly noted as well. Halloween did something. It shocked audiences, it scared the hell out of everyone, and it was a wonderful experience that was almost more than a film, as well as gaining over $70 million at the box office versus its $300,000 budget, and becoming the 10th highest grossing film of 1978. With that, Irwin Yablans and now Mustafa Akkad wanted sequels. John Carpenter and Deborah Hill came back to write and produce, and it was here that they devised the infamous sibling twist since Empire Strikes Back just came out. Rick Rosenthal was chosen to helm the film, and Dean Cundey came back to do the cinematography. It was a financial hit, but many complained that the gore that was lacking in the first film was a major detriment. Then, since Michael was dead, they devised to make a film not about Michael Myers, but have it be an anthology series instead, similar to Night Gallery. Active crew member Tommy Lee Wallace was chosen to direct a script by Nigel Neal, who eventually wanted his name off the film since they did major rewrites, and so Wallace got sole credit for writing. It was a massive failure purely on the grounds that Myers was not in it and people wanted more Myers despite him being dead. Then Carpenter, Hill, and Yablans were all out. Akkad, at first, was on his own and produced sequel after sequel. Then we had Dimension coming in after the fifth film, and we got 3 more sequels. Now, many years later, a reboot saga that will hopefully end Laurie and Michael's relationship. Eventually, like every beloved horror franchise, we got a remake, and unlike most, we got a sequel to that remake with the Rob Zombie films. This was due to the success of other such horror remakes, and Dimension wanted that cash money. I don't ever plan on seeing them because I don't really like Zombie as a filmmaker, nor really as a musician, and I feel like Zombie's interpretation was just kinda dull. Oh, Michael is more brutal and more human, but also not. Cool, I guess. But it is interesting how out of all the remakes, this one got the sequel. Only other movie to do that was Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but even then, that was a prequel. In terms of the rest of the franchise, as much as I like the various sequels, Halloween is pretty much the most lackluster franchise in terms of it actually becoming a franchise. This and maybe Hellraiser. Freddy, Jason, Chucky, Jigsaw, they feel like their franchises made sense and had a point. Halloween really shouldn't have continued past the first one. It was only the desire of a selected few who wanted to continue it. But in reality, having that ending of not knowing where Michael is, where he could be, is one of the scariest endings for a horror film ever, and it was ruined by having Halloween become a franchise. Despite this, I would be lying if I said I hated Halloween as a franchise. It's sort of a love-hate thing, because the legacy of Halloween knows no bounds. As angry as I am we got a sequel, it might not have been a cultural touchstone like it is now, and I might not be here talking about it if it wasn't for that franchise. Also, it even got extended media with comic books and books, although more so with the former than the latter. and even an Atari 2600 video game, but less said about that the better. Despite the fact that most of the Halloween sequels are terrible, there is sort of this weird love for the franchise that can't be explained. So many people love it and keep coming back for more. The 1978 film Halloween is embedded into this culture and refuses to let go. Not just this franchise, but this one movie. It did so much for its genre. It catapulted so many careers. It literally changed everything. Literally in the actual sense. Without it, the horror genre would not be where it is today. Michael Myers, Dr. Samuel Loomis, Laurie Strode, and the music by Carpenter and Alan Howarth are all iconic. While that word has sort of lost its meaning in recent years, Halloween is sort of the tried and true original meaning of iconic. It pushed so many boundaries. Carpenter pushed the limits of what could be scary. Deborah Hill pushed the boundaries for women in film, both on-screen and off-screen. Irwin Yablans pushed the limits of the horrors of the mind. Mustafa Akkad pushed for this film to break its one-film story, for better or for worse. The crew pushed beyond themselves to create a movie that would just, at the very least, be good. Nobody planned for this film to do anything, but it did. It somehow managed to be the greatest it possibly could, when all it was just a shape hunting babysitters while his psychiatrist and the sheriff try to stop him. Nothing more than that, but Carpenter, Hill, Yablans, Cundy, Castle, and every single one of the production crew managed to make it more than just that, and we will forever be grateful. This concludes Monster Madness 6. I hope you had a fun time with this changed up format, and expect some bonus material next month that I couldn't fit here. Have a fun, safe, but still truly frightening Halloween, everyone. Just be careful of that man standing behind you.